The following message was given at Grace Community Church in Minden, Nevada.
In 1997, God gave me a double blessing that has lasted for almost 30 years. I met Jim Neuheiser, and he was my research advisor at Westminster Seminary, and there were not very many Baptists, and so Jim and I hit it off. And in that same year, I met someone who would end up being one of my dearest friends, and that's Pastor Robert Elliott. And he and Janice and really the entire church in Riverside is very, very dear to us. And so Robert has been the pastor at Riverside Reformed Baptist Church, or Reformed Baptist Church of Riverside, whatever the appropriate order is, I can never remember, for 30 years, right? We just did 30 years, right? And you will immediately notice that he's not originally from Riverside. All right, and so, brother, come on up.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk this morning about David Livingstone. He is a man that I think you'll agree is worth discussing, and we're going to see him a little bit faults and all. I do enjoy missionary biographies. I think, just as Brian said a moment ago, it's vital that our children read missionary biographies, watch the little cartoons about the missionaries, so that they get that bigger vision that the church isn't just where you take them on a Sunday, but there's also a sense in which the seeds get planted for things that I do believe can turn into great tools in the Saviour's hands. And we'll see at the end, if we've got time, just the influence David Livingstone had on many others that went out into the mission field, which is notable as well. One of the things I think is important about missionary biographies is that we recognize that they are just men, and just because they do something doesn't mean that it's right. I've heard so many biographies, and things have been said that I'm sitting thinking, well, that's ridiculous. They shouldn't have done that. And then maybe around a cup of coffee after, other brothers are saying, wow, wasn't that amazing? One recently was, we were told in a missionary biography about a man who, he was far away from his children, the other side of the world, and his wife died with him, and he had little boys in England, and he wrote them a letter, and the letter was, "Dear Charlie, Mummy has gone to play in Jesus' garden." And wee Charlie was getting this letter in England, that Mummy has gone to play in Jesus' garden. And everybody else is going, that's beautiful. And I'm thinking, that's ridiculous. He should have left and went home and told the wee boy that Jesus has got his mummy now, rather than through a letter. In other words, just because missionaries do something doesn't make it right. And we're going to see that with David Livingstone. And yet, he's still a hero, still a man that God used in a mighty way. There's probably more information about Livingstone than any other missionary, and you'll see the reason why. His journals, his diaries were sent all over the world and preserved. His thoughts, his moods, the little side conversations that people had with him. People, when they realized who this guy was, they would say maybe 10 years later, oh, I talked with that guy 10 years ago. And they would write down stories about what was said. So there's more information about him than almost anybody else that has gone out to the mission field, which makes it difficult because there's so much that we're not going to talk about today. We'll hardly mention the Dr. Livingstone, I presume, episode, and yet everybody talks about it. It's a famous episode, but there's many things that we've had to leave out. Just a little bit of background. Africa. North Africa was one of the first areas to be evangelized outside of Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria. There's a real sense in which North Africa was in there at the very beginning. And names such as Clement, Augustine, Athanasius, Cyprian are just examples of the quality of individuals that North Africa produced in the first few centuries. That whole northern region of Africa was well Christianized until about the 7th century, when Islam began its very aggressive march into Africa. And in so doing, many Christians were killed, and many, over a couple of generations, more than a couple of generations, decided to move to other parts, other places. It became a very dangerous place for Christians. And so, in a sense, while we look at the north of Africa and see it as an Islamic stronghold, there was a time when it was very, very Christian. Now, it wasn't really until about the 15th century that Christendom, you notice the difference there, Christian, Christendom. About the 15th century, Christendom began to influence the coastal regions of Africa. And that was through the Portuguese initially. And they found it a very lucrative thing to send their ships down the west coast and then eventually up the east coast and to begin to colonize different regions there. And in so doing, they were able to say, well, we're doing this for the sake of the church. And that was one of the significant features of the early Portuguese, and then following that, the Spanish conquests into Africa. It wasn't just we're doing this to expand these countries or nations. It was we're doing this for the good of the people and for the sake of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And they had the Pope's blessing as they did that again and again. Now, there's a real sense in which that allowed them to treat the people very cruelly because it was for their good. And if the people didn't understand and didn't comply, well, in God's name, we'll make them comply. And in a sense, even the early slavery that began to be a tremendously lucrative industry, it was in God's name. Now, I know that today we think that's utterly ridiculous, and it is, but there was a time when that was the standard idea behind even slavery at the very beginning. We're doing this for their good. We're taking them out of their heathen darkness, and we're taking them to places where they can be influenced by the church, and so on. Now, it wasn't until about maybe the 15th, 16th century that Moravian missionaries began to go to Africa. And again, very limited, not able to really penetrate the inland, but nevertheless, the gospel began to be preached in Africa about 15th, 16th century. And then it was about the 19th century before what we would call Protestant evangelicals reached Africa properly. Now, that means that for about 1,800 plus years, the Great Commission hadn't yet been properly executed, hadn't really begun in that massive continent. It's not that there were no Christians, but there was a sense in which for the first time the modern missionary movement brought the gospel to that massive continent. And David Livingstone, in many ways, is at the forefront of it. Not that he was the first missionary, as we're going to hear, but he in many ways became the spearhead of taking the gospel to the vast part of southern Africa and central Africa that had lay for 1,800 years gospel-less. It's quite a thought, isn't it? All those years, centuries, and the church had been told, go to the furthest corners of the earth, and the church hadn't yet until Livingstone and his compatriots. David Livingstone, he was born, I think I can see the screens there, that's good. He was born in Blantyre in Scotland. And Blantyre's just outside Glasgow, and he was born into a very poor family. He was one of 7 children. Both his parents were solid Christians. His dad, Neil Livingstone, was a Highlander, and his mother came from Covenanter stock. And when he was a little boy, his family attended the local kirk. That means whatever church is in that community kind of owns that community. Presbyterian churches, and you go to your kirk. Except his dad was unhappy at the kirk. And it wasn't long until he would, every Sunday, make his little family walk 6-7 miles. One way, 6-7 miles, to attend what has been described as an independent congregational conventicle. These were the hardliners, if you like, and Neil Livingstone was one of them. But David heard the gospel every single day, and on the Lord's Day, twice from the preacher. The whole family lived on the premises that you see there, a cotton mill in Blantyre, in a tiny one-roomed apartment. Most of us today would consider it maybe big enough to have a family room. In the size of that apartment. The children, they were stacked on shelves, basically shelves built into the wall, and I guess the older one got the higher shelf, and the little ones were more accessible down the bottom. There were 5 children, and everything was done in the room. Everything. There was a bath that would be brought in and put in front of the coal fire, and the water would be heated, and literally one after another they would take a bath. And if you were last in, the water was, well, let's just say a little dirty. But it was a tight ship in the Livingstone home. The last application of the rod by David's father to young David's thighs and buttocks was because David had secretly been reading Dr. Thomas Dick's work on natural theology instead of the systematic theology that his dad had told him to read. And by the way, that book on natural theology is a classic. It was no lightweight book, is no lightweight book. I'm sure there's at least somebody here this morning that has spanked their son for reading Gerhardus Voss's natural theology rather than what you told them, like John Gill's Doctrine of the Trinity stated. Well, that was Neil Livingstone, and that's how David was raised. At 10 years of age, he started working in the mill that is attached to the house and unit that you see there. So at 10 years of age, he would work 14 hours a day and then go straight to school for 3 hours, and then go home, do the chores he was told to do, and then get to bed and do it all over again until the Lord's Day, and that was truly the day of rest. But he had to walk 6 miles to church and back again. What David did was, with a little bit of the wage that he got from his work, his parents took the most of it, but that little bit of salary that he had, he bought himself a Latin grammar. That was the first thing he bought. And he placed it on the machine that he was given responsibility for at 10, 11 years of age. And he placed it in a strategic place so that as he would walk back and forward, he would be able to look at it, take another wee glance, do his business, another wee glance, do his business. And he thought that that was the smartest thing. He was incorporating his Latin studies in with his work. His workmates, most of whom were illiterate, they were not too happy with him. It's portrayed as practical jokes and pranks, but they were just plain jealous of him. And they would take his book and hide it. And then they would all laugh as he would go into a frenzy and panic. His precious Latin grammar had disappeared. He was a young man that was determined to train his mind, although from extreme poverty. When he was in his late teens, however, he realized it wasn't just his mind that needed trained. He started to actually hear the gospel. He had heard it 1,000 times more, but now he heard it. Here's his own words taken from his book, Travels. Great pains had been taken by my parents to instill the doctrines of Christianity into my mind, and I had no difficulty in understanding the theory of our free salvation by the atonement of our Savior. But it was only about this time that I really began to feel the necessity and the value of the personal application of the provisions of that atonement for myself. The change was like what may be supposed would take place. Would it be possible to cure a deep case of color blindness? The perfect freeness with which the pardon of our guilt is offered in God's book drew forth feelings of affection and love to him, the one who bought us with his blood, and a deep sense of obligation to him, for his mercy has influenced in some small measure my conduct ever since. But I'll not speak of my own inner spiritual life, which I believe then began, nor do I intend to specify with any prominence the evangelistic labors to which the love of Christ has since impelled me. This book in which he's writing, this book will not speak so much about what has been done as what still remains to be performed before the gospel can be said to be preached to all nations. In the glow of love which Christianity inspires, I soon resolved to devote my life to the alleviation of human misery, and therefore set myself to obtain a medical education in order to be qualified for that enterprise. He's a teenager. This is what he wrote. I now believe the gospel. I'm a changed man, and for me the change is I want to go out into this world with a medical bag to minister to people and show them the love of Christ. Pretty good, isn't it? Powerful. A very clear conversion and a mentality. He's not yet thinking about foreign fields. He's thinking about maybe Glasgow, maybe Edinburgh, maybe that place, London, so far away. But he wants to go out and for the cause of Christ the King, get busy. So raised in a solid Calvinistic context, he, right at that point, is embracing the doctrines of grace wholeheartedly. But for him, and this comes out over the next several decades, for him, the truths of Calvinism are to be held primarily by the affections and not the head. He says things to that effect on dozens and dozens of occasions. He was early persuaded that compassion would be the compelling quality of someone who knew God's grace in their life. Hard-heartedness, pernicketiness, bitterness should have no place. So he went to Glasgow as soon as he was able, as a young man, I believe 21, to the university, which was then known as Anderson College, now Strathclyde University. And he went to study medicine and theology. And then a couple of years later, he left Glasgow and took his worldly belongings down to London to study medicine and theology in the more prestigious situation in London. His aptitude and his attitude combined to make him a notable student. One who was quickly admired by his professors. Perhaps the main catalyst for him really thinking in terms of Africa came about this point when he was 26 years of age. He heard a man named Robert Moffat, another Scotsman, who had been in Africa. I forget the pictures I've put up, men. Let me see. Okay, there's David Livingstone. We'll get to that one. So, when I'm preparing the PowerPoint, I think, oh yeah, it'll be easy. I'll remember to press the button, and I never do. I get carried away talking and I always forget. But he heard Robert Moffat, who'd been in Africa for many years, and Moffat spoke of the fact that in Africa, he looked out in the mornings and he saw many sunrises when in the distance from his camp he would see the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary had ever been and the gospel had never been preached. And as he said those words, Livingstone realized, well, it's not London for me, and it's not China. He'd been thinking about China. I need to go to Africa, to those villages. He had no idea what those villages would look like. There were no PowerPoints for him to look at. There was no Google Images for him to search. It was an absolute unknown, but he was gripped with a desire to go to Africa. And around this time, he began to come to the attention of new people. And eventually, several of these people would write memoirs about the days in which David Livingstone, as a student in London, was preparing for the mission field. And it's strange that many of them actually found it necessary to comment on his looks. And I should say it was never complimentary. They are unanimous that he was not a handsome man. The Reverend Walter Ingalls wrote, "I have to admit he was no bonny." That means he wasn't good to look at. The Reverend Joseph Moore writes, he had by no means a winning face. When I would read these things, occasionally I've quietly shouted at the book, "Leave the guy alone." But another thing that we should mention is that he was also not a great preacher. Not only was that the consensus of everybody who comments on his preaching during his days in London when he was visiting little churches to minister, but it was his own assessment. He actually writes of his dread and difficulty of speaking in the public realm, especially in his 20s. At one time in a small congregation in London, he stood up, opened his Bible, looked at the people, his mind went blank, and he said, "My friends, I have forgotten all I have to say." And he closed his Bible, and with a very dignified gait, he walked down the aisle, opened the door, closed it, and left. Never said another word. He wrote of himself, "I am a very poor preacher, having a bad delivery. Some have said that if I enter the pulpit again, they will not enter the chapel." He asked different people to give him references for the London Missionary Society, and one of the comments is, "His long hesitations in conducting public prayer and his utter failure in the pulpit are unpardonable." This is real. He was ugly and he was a bad preacher. Hey, bring him here. He's welcome. He could be part of us. But there were times that he just turned down opportunities to speak. Not because he was ashamed of the gospel, but because he would look around and decide, no, there's others can do better than me. I'm just not doing it. So when he was thinking about the mission field, what was on his mind? What was on the mind of the London Missionary Society, parachurch organization, when they agreed to sign him up and make him one of their missionaries? I don't know the answers to that. It's not a question that I'm going to give you a good answer for. It seems a bit strange, doesn't it? But what you do have is a young, enthusiastic, committed guy who has a medical bag and a heart for the gospel. But he's not a preacher. He's not even a public prayer. David Livingstone's view was one soul at a time. His view was, kneel down beside a sick soul who's got a sick body and help the body first. And as I do that, I'll show them the love of Christ. Not just show them the love of Christ, I'll tell them about the love of Christ. So it was one soul at a time in his mind from the very beginning. As time developed, he would become the guy that would enter new territory, as we're going to see, to minister to one soul at a time. He was sent out in 1840 by the London Missionary Society. At this point, he's been a Christian for about 6-7 years. And many weeks it took to get to South Africa, and then it was a 10-week hike from Port Elizabeth up to the Kuruman, where he would meet with Robert Moffat. It was a 10-week trudge that he never had experienced in his life. I can picture the shock that he would have, because I know Blantyre, where he lived, is nothing like Africa. And to walk 6 miles to church on a Sunday was maybe the beginning of it for him. But this was a whole new experience. And rather than being put off, he was motivated. The challenges of the prairies, the challenges of the jungle would stir him up in a wonderful way. The spirit of adventure that he had meant that he would soon, after 6 months in Kuruman, he would want to go further. And so he, with another few individuals, plodded on another couple of 100 miles into uncharted territory, and they went to Mabotsa. And there they began to minister, him particularly with his medical bag in hand. He had a substantial amount of money with him, so he was able to have an entourage and individuals with him carrying his stuff. So when this gentleman would appear to a new tribal community, he came with lots of individuals, an ensemble with him, and he was able to create an impression, get their attention, and generally be accepted. Naturally, with so many porters and helpers, he had a lot of help with the language, and he was quick to learn different languages and dialects within the tribal contexts. At time, the attention he got in these early days was not positive. One time, a gun was fired, and it did just almost graze his ear. And another time, a spear was thrown, and it grazed the back of his neck. It was aimed at his head. So it was a bit challenging, but he was settling in Africa nevertheless. However, while at Mabotsa, there was a situation developed with some lions. The lions, local lions, realized that if there were cattle penned in, then they were easy to kill. And so they were picking off some cattle from the local tribal people. And Livingstone, who had never seen a lion in his life, decided that he would lead an expedition to go and kill a lion. And he figured, if I kill one lion, then the others will run away. He didn't quite understand how lions thought. But the situation developed that he went out with a group of men, and they found the lions. And you maybe know the story. This is what he said in his journals. I saw the lion just in the act of springing upon me. I was upon a little height, and he caught my shoulder as he sprang, and we both came to the ground below together. Growling horribly close to my ear, he shook me as a terrier does a rat. The shock produced a stupor similar to that which seems to be felt by a mouse after the first shake in the cat's mouth. It caused a sort of dreaminess in me, in which there was no sense of pain, no feeling of terror. The shaking annihilated my fear and allowed no sense of horror in looking round at the beast. This peculiar state is probably produced in all animals killed by carnivora, and if so, is a merciful provision of our benevolent Creator for lessening the pain of death. He said, turning round to relieve myself of the weight as he had one paw on the back of my head, I saw his eyes directed to Mbalwe, one of his friends, who was trying to shoot him from a distance of 10 to 15 yards. His gun, a flint one, misfired on both barrels. The lion immediately left me and, attacking me belly, bit his thigh. Another man whose life I had saved before, after he had been tossed by a buffalo, attempted to spear the lion while he was biting me belly. He left my shoulder and caught the man by his shoulder, but at that moment the bullets he had received took effect and he fell down dead. So that was an early experience, really just months there. And this is the encounter he has. And he was impacted by this for the rest of his life. When you think of all the things you're going to hear about what David Livingstone did, his great exploits, remember, he really didn't have a left arm. He had a very painful experience in that arm for the rest of his life. It wasn't helped because 6 months after this, he was helping someone build a wall and a brick fell, and instinctively he grabbed it and pulled everything again, and it just set himself back and even made it worse than it was. So you could say it was a bit of a tragedy, and yet there was a silver lining in the cloud, because he had to go back to Kuruman. And the only person that could really look after him on this occasion with his bad arm was Robert Moffat's daughter, Mary. And she showed him such care and such attention that he fell in love with her. And he married her. And she was just fit for a guy like this. She was a missionary's daughter who was, if you like, a bit rough and ready, willing to face the lions of Africa and go through the jungles of that great continent. And in God's providence, David was blessed with a wonderful wife. Okay, I forgot about this one. Let me just go back to it then. So they arrived there, Port Elizabeth, went up to Kuruman. The lion adventure was Mabotsa, back to Kuruman. And now they're going to go back up to Mabotsa. This is how good a wife Mary was. Their honeymoon was a 200-mile jungle journey. That was their honeymoon, to go to Mabotsa. And when they got there, they decided that they should set up a mission station from which other missionaries could come and launch out further afield. This was how it was going to go with David Livingstone. Wherever he would go, he would set something up and then launch out, set something up and launch out. And in so doing, allowing other missionaries to come behind him and then spread in different directions from these mission stations. It was a great idea. But when they went to Mabotsa for the first time as a young married couple, that wasn't really on their mind. They were thinking, well, we'll just do here what's been done at Kuruman. But it wasn't going to be easy, because he was there with other missionaries from the London Missionary Society. One was called Roger Edwards, an older man. And Roger Edwards was so jealous of him. These are the things that happen on the mission field. When missionaries go, they take sinners with them, namely themselves. And there was all kinds of tensions. Early on, Livingstone thought, well, we could set up a seminary here so that Africans could come and be trained, and then they could be sent out. And guys like Edwards and others thought that is the most ridiculous thing we've ever heard. Why would we send Africans to the Africans? And it became very tense. Edwards actually wrote, I strongly resent being made an appendix of this younger man. You know, it's just pure jealousy. And then there was a period of time for several months when every single day they bickered. Him and Livingstone bickered. Thankfully, most of the Africans didn't know what they were saying. But they just got on to one another again and again, so much so that Livingstone decided, we're moving. We're going to leave. He wrote a letter at this point to one of his friends in the UK, and he said to him, promise you can keep a secret? And I think the guy said, I promise that every person I tell, I'll tell him not to tell someone. You know that kind of person? So he said to him, I could have chewed up, this is my version of it, I could have chewed up Roger Edwards. I could have beat him. I could have caused these old guys to run for the hills. But I just decided I'll back down and I'll use this as an opportunity to move on. And he did. And they moved further to the north, to Chonuni, which is in modern-day Botswana. And there he met a man named Sechel, an African chief, a chief of the Bakwena tribe. The Bakwena tribe were part of the Tswana people. So you have a people group, massive people group, tens of thousands, and within the people group you've got tribes, but they're all part of the same people group. And this man, Sechel, instantly was in admiration of David Livingstone. There was just something in him. He was ready to listen to this man. And he longed to be able to read. So Livingstone took him up on it and, of course, gave him the best book in the world to learn to read with, the Bible. And Sechel would read the Bible loud to his people constantly. And it would seem that he actually genuinely early on was believing what he was reading. Now, I want to just say at this point, Sechel probably was David Livingstone's only actual convert in his whole missionary encounter experience. All that was done, one man, as far as we know, came to Christ. But then there are some who would say, did he really come to Christ? And I'll explain that in a minute as well. But Sechel was an influential man who wanted to see Livingstone's desire fleshed out, namely that Africa would be Christianized. And he was so anxious that that would happen that he said to Livingstone on one occasion, do you imagine these people will ever believe you by merely talking to them? I can make them do nothing without thrashing them. And if you like, I can call my head man with his whips, and we will soon have them all believing together. That's one way of doing it, folks. Of course, Livingstone knew that wasn't the way. Remember, a man of compassion, a man with a heart for people. But nevertheless, it shows a little bit of Sechel's desire, at first, of course, foolish desire, to evangelize. But that man did go on with the Lord after lots of bumpy, rocky moments. For example, very early on, because he had 5 wives, Livingstone said, your first wife's your wife, and you need to put the others away. And he agreed at the beginning. And then as time went by, several months went by, he thought that wasn't such a good idea, and he secretly began to take his wives again. And one of them did get pregnant. And that came to Livingstone's attention, and Livingstone didn't excommunicate him because he had no ecclesiological authority, but he basically banned him from communion and what have you. They disciplined him, if you like, with the form of order that they had at that moment in that context. And there was a bit of a falling out, but never a falling out to the point that they were enemies, but there was a sense in which Sechel went on a little bit more himself. And he did bring in and allowed some African traditions that we would probably think are dark and weird. He allowed these things to be permitted in the villages, while at the same time preaching Christ. I mean, actually preaching Christ. Preaching the sufficiency of Scripture, while allowing cultural things that we would perhaps say, yeah, if you understood these things more, you would see that these don't match up with Scripture. Nothing's perfect, right? But nevertheless, the gospel was going forth, so much so that after about 40 years, multitudes of these people were Christians. There's one story of a group of missionaries from Holland going to, in this case, the Zulu people, one of the tribal Zulu groups, assuming that, well, they've never heard the gospel. They're an unreached people group, as we would use that term today. And they were shocked to discover that this particular group that they went to already knew the gospel and already had Christian traditions, and it came from Seychelles. So in a sense, while David Livingstone wasn't a preacher, while he didn't have much by way of fruit from his evangelizing, as far as he knew, again, he doesn't know everything. God could have worked in ways that he doesn't know. But nevertheless, that was a key moment when Seychelles came to Christ. And if nothing else, God sent David Livingstone to Africa for that. While this is all going on, Livingstone, still fairly newly married, having little kids, young family. I think I might have a picture of the family. No, that's them in one of the villages. Remember, they didn't have cameras, and literally these old pictures, the one of him with the lion and that, they all go back to Livingstone's day, and with his approval, they show what he wants to be seen in England and Scotland and America at that time. But yes, they had a family, and the family, the children were with mum and dad for a good while. They stayed with them in Africa, but it was felt that perhaps it would be best that the family would be sent home, and that Mary would spend time at home with the children as well. And so in 1856, Livingstone went back to England. And when he did, he was shocked, because the arrival of his boat was greeted by basically fanfare, bands, media, every newspaper in England and some from America. He didn't realize that the letters he'd been sending back to the London Missionary Society about Africa were being published. And every Christian in the United Kingdom knew about David Livingstone, and he was considered a hero even secularly. Queen Victoria wanted to meet with him, and he had a special meeting with the Queen. Suddenly, this guy that's been spending these years in Africa, in a very lonely situation, he's thrust into the limelight when he comes back. And he discovers that there is a massive interest in what is going on. But at this stage, while he's back home, he's rethinking his plan. He's rethinking what he should do. And what he actually was concluding was that he wasn't really a preacher. He wasn't really a church planter. That was for others. He should really just be that guy that goes off into the jungle and opens up new opportunities for other missionaries. That should be his focus. Whether he was right or wrong in that is a matter of everybody's opinion, and there's 1,000 opinions, I'm sure, about that. But he considered that to be his strength. So he spoke with the London Missionary Society, and they were not happy with that. I think we could understand that. Their money was to be primarily used for the propagation of the gospel, and they didn't share the vision with Livingstone that someone spearheading the advance of missionary opportunities was worth their money. But the Royal Geographical Society at that point said, we'll pay for that. Because they were enjoying the letters and the maps. It was wonderful. This was a day of advancement in England, the Victorian era. It was a day of optimism. And the Royal Geographical Society are thinking, well, what we should do is we should send Livingstone out there, and we can basically advance Britain's cause. And Livingstone was willing to be used in that way because it meant that he could see more of Africa, but he could open it up for the gospel. So it was kind of like the one was using the other, and they would be happy together. But it did cause a division between Livingstone and, in a sense, even the missionary cause. Some of the missionaries saw him now as not a traitor, but someone who had left the fold. And in many ways, because of these realities, Livingstone is still allowed to be a hero in Scotland. And I mean that because they can emphasize that, he wasn't all about going to people and daring to tell them that their ways are wrong. You know, it almost fits the modern politically correct agenda. You could tell this story in a way that suits that Livingstone realized that these people didn't need the gospel, so to speak. And that's not true. Absolutely not true. He saw himself as still part of that missionary cause, but doing what he could do. He discovered he was an explorer. He didn't know that when he was in Blantyre, but now he knows he's an explorer. Now he knows he's brave and that he's willing to do these kinds of things. He knows how to do it, how to get a team together, how to make them go into dangerous places. And he saw that as a way of promoting the gospel. He believed that Africa could be truly brought to Christ and that the slave trade could truly be ended if there could be progress. And if progress and advancement of culture could be adopted, then there would be gospel opportunities. I hope that makes that clear. I think it is important because it's so weird when you're at the Livingstone Centre. That building I showed you earlier is now all polished up and cleaned up, and it's a tourist attraction. And the story they give you would make you mad. You would get into an argument with the little docent that's there telling you the story. You've got to keep yourself very calm and hope for a wee opportunity to speak to her or him at some point, because the story is bad. But nevertheless, Livingstone did go back to Africa and did desire to push forward for the gospel's sake. He had already discovered the Victoria Falls, and now he's looking for the source of the River Nile. And that never actually happened. He wasn't successful with that. But nevertheless, he sought to advance the access for the Western world into Africa. One of the things that I did mention a moment ago is that his wife and family went back to England. And when he was about 45 and she's about 37, they decided to bring her back to Africa. She was there for a season, then back to England, and then he brought her back again. Children are still in England. Basically, they never saw their dad very much at all. And then on this next return to Africa, after 6 months, Mary, because she got malaria and various other problems, she died. And he was left on his own. They were married for about 18 years. 9 years they were together, and 9 years they were apart. Again, things that some of these missionaries did that now we might say, well, no, you can't do that. If you can't live together, you can't be on the field. But back then, this was the way it was done. While he was there that second time, without now Mary, now as a widower, he had many run-ins with the Portuguese and now the Muslim slave traders. Obviously, they greatly opposed him and he them. And he would speak of the slave trade as the open sore of the world. And every letter he would send back to Britain had something about the atrocities. One time in 1871, he actually saw the Arabs shoot about 400 villagers, just massacre people in a very remote area of the Congo. And it's kind of like, X today, Twitter. If that wasn't there, we wouldn't know half the things that are going on. And if Livingstone wasn't in Africa, the Western world wouldn't have known really the gross inhumanity of how slaves were rounded up, how they were treated, how they were brought to the coasts and then sent off to the not the United States really at that time, but mostly the Caribbean and then eventually America as well. But Livingstone managed to move the opportunity for opposing slavery slightly more than it would have if he wasn't there in Africa. He was an old man, and for 6 years he disappeared. We don't really know much about those 6 years, but he vanished. His supplies ran out so that even his notes and his diaries became sparser and sparser. And you probably do know the story of Henry Morton Stanley being sent over by the New York Herald to find him. Took 8 months to find him. Most of the world thought that Livingstone was dead at this point, but eventually Stanley found him, and then that was that little quote that I gave earlier, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Stanley spent some time with him, resupplied him, gave him more of the things that he needed. And rather than taking this as an opportunity to go home as an older man and settle down, he decided that he would just keep pressing on and try to find the source of the River Nile. He never found it, as I said earlier, and in 1873 he died. And there's so many stories. Some of them we think are just legends. They're not necessarily true. When I was young, I read that he died with his finger pointing at the Bible, and the passage, I will never leave you nor forsake you, and it said in the margin, the words of a gentleman. Some say that that happened, and many others say that never happened, that it came later. Who knows? But what we do know is that he was found dead at his bedside on his knees, and it's assumed that he was praying, and it's very possible. He was a godly man, a spiritually minded man, a Christ-loving man, a man that loved the souls of people, and even although he ended his life not primarily as a missionary, nevertheless, he ended his life as a man of God who had opened the door for many, many missionaries. He had a couple of friends that stuck with him through the years, Susie and Chuma, and they took his heart, cut it out, buried it under a tree, carried his body 1,000 miles, took him to the coast. His body was shipped to England, and you remember how I described the lavish, grand reception he got the first time? Well, now his corpse is received not with bands, but with great solemnity. The whole country turned out. And he was buried at Westminster Abbey and is still there. And honestly, it's really just kings and queens and David Livingstone that are buried at Westminster Abbey. It's quite amazing. I don't have time to get into his legacy. I thought I would. But there were many who heard his story as children. Horace Walden, an individual who was stirred up by Livingstone and went to Africa to document the issues of slavery, and he added to this campaign to end it. Henry Faulds, Frederick Stanley grew up in Scotland, these guys, and ended up going off to various parts of the world as missionaries. Many others seeing the medical missionary idea that David Livingstone hadn't pioneered. There were others before him, but he had brought the idea of a medical missionary to the forefront, and many went out into Africa, Asia, all over the world. Even some went to Japan in those days as medical missionaries. You maybe have heard of Mary Slessor. Interesting young woman, also Scottish, heard stories about Livingstone as a kid, and she went off to Africa. Again, we wouldn't say it's necessarily the way we would send somebody out, but she went, and she had a great impact in African culture and brought the gospel to little local tribes where she was. God really used this man. Imperfect, many deficiencies, many faults, but God used him in a mighty way. And for us to just be reminded of the story of someone like David Livingstone, I trust is good for us and stirs us up to say, well, Lord, would you just do it again? Keep raising these kinds of guys up. They don't all have to just fit the bill, be the perfect missionary on paper. Just men that love the Lord and are willing to go and are willing to take the truth where they go and use the gifts that they have. And sometimes it might be a wee bit unorthodox and a wee bit off the wall. But how God can use this. And let's have a holy imagination and be willing to be part of that, men, if God is pleased to use us. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
We hope that you were edified by this message. For additional sermons as well as information on giving to the ministry of Grace Community Church, please visit us online at gracenevada.com. That's gracenevada.com.